Hi, I'm Futong Chang of Chang Design in Berkeley, and you're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world, or out of this world. I'm Tom Guild. In a world where people are reading newspapers less and less frequently, at least a printed kind, the New York Times is still regarded as America's best national paper. Sorry, Washington Post. Within the walls of the New York Times building in Manhattan is their architecture critic and today's guest, Pulitzer Prize finalist, twice, Michael Kimmelman. Later on, we'll meet jazz vocalist Monika Ryan. And now, your host, never nominated for a Pulitzer, Mr. Modernism, George Smart.
Thanks, Tom. I did win a Wurlitzer once. Does that count? I mean,
Sure.
That's a prize.
Yeah.
I entered on a Write on a Postcard contest in third grade and won a Wurlitzer organ. My mom was less than overjoyed. She wrote the company and turned it down because who wants a 9-year-old banging on an organ all day? That and Mom was not into pop music of the time, which prominently featured the Hammond organ. So instead, she bought me some Legos and peace was restored to the universe. Those postcard contests were pretty cool. We did a few back in the first year of the podcast, so we're going to do one again. Just send a postcard with your name, phone number, and email to U.S. Modernist Radio, 5409 Pelham Road, that's P-E-L-H-A-M, Durham, North Carolina, 27713. Limit one per person, and we'll draw for some great U.S. Modernist swag this summer and fall. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger, and by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs.
Michael Kimmelman is the architecture critic for the New York Times. He's also the founder of Headway, an initiative focused on large global challenges and paths to progress. A graduate of PS 41 in Greenwich Village, he got his start as the editor of a design magazine, as well as the architecture critic for New England Monthly. After a stint as the chief art critic for the New York Times, he moved to Berlin to create the Abroad column, covering cultural, political, and social affairs in Europe and the Middle East. These days, he writes on not just architecture, but design, housing and homelessness, neighborhood development, cities, and the environment and civil society. George spoke with Michael at the New York Times building in New York, the one designed by Renzo Piano.
Michael, let's start with the serious questions first. In the chess game of journalism, is the New York Times going to be the last piece standing, do you think?
Well, this is a very dire moment. Look, it's not just about, we're here to talk about architectural things, but the truth is that, American democracy depends, as do all democracies, on a robust press and especially a local presence. And that has been, dying in America. It's a really serious problem. If you don't have people out there covering city council meetings and reporting on what's happening locally, people are not informed. It's really also newspapers were kind of common ground for people, a public square. People got most of what newspapers did was just neutral and still is, the weather, what happened, as I said, at some meeting.
What Nancy and Sluggo were doing this week.
What Nancy and Sluggo were doing, exactly. What the stocks did. A lot of very straightforward stuff, and people would sort of meet around that. So this is a big issue. The Times was in financial distress, as everybody knows, and made certain decisions which at the moment seem like the right ones. They were essentially to invest in more high-end journalism, to expand our global coverage, and to turn from advertising to subscriber-based. And that's so far working for us. the jury's not entirely settled, but we have obviously, been one of the bright shining lights in journalism. And
yes,
I will say I'm very grateful. Like everybody here, I appreciate the privilege of being here, but I also I'm aware that we, you can't just have 1, 2, or 3, or even 5 news outlets that are actually not completely craven. You need them all over. So your question is troubling. I don't know the answer to that. It's the future of journalism is at stake. I really believe that.
Well, one of the things I notice about the Times is that it's done a great job of becoming almost like a news network. I mean, there's so much video production now that you see both online and even referred to in the newspaper itself, in the print edition. I go on and now I can get, many different aspects of the news that I couldn't before 10 years ago on a very limited basis.
So you read the print edition?
Yeah.
Do you also look online?
I do, yeah. Both.
Well, God bless you. Godspeed. Yeah, I said that we made those earlier calculations. We also made another one, which was that we would throw stuff at the wall and see what worked.
Yeah.
And so we were inventive. Early on, we invested in a lot of digital graphics, video, podcasting. And I'll say as a writer here, and then now someone who's sort of created a new department in the paper as well, the thing that I've noticed has changed over the years of the Times is that it became much more open to throwing things at the wall and seeing what worked. And that also, as a result, became a place where if you're interested in trying new things, you could. So, for instance, with architecture, architecture is experienced not just two-dimensionally through a photograph, which a glossy magazine can represent, but in time, spatially. So it's very different to move through a space, to show a space or building or block or a neighborhood from the air and from the ground and moving across a street. Or it sounds simple, but it changes the way we can tell the story of architecture. It's a simple thing. Sometimes what you want are the ability to talk about it in a way that was like we're talking now. Sometimes that's a more effective way to engage people. So I think that was really the thing that the Times did from my perspective that was so wonderful, that it opened itself up to being something other than just a print thing that appeared in a particular form with a certain kind of writing.
More specific to architecture, are you a Doctor Who fan by any chance?
You could have chosen a million other things. My wife's more familiar with Doctor Who. I never quite got into Doctor Who. Where's this going?
So in Doctor Who, there are these Time Lords that come on, and they last about 3 years in real time, maybe 5, and then they go away and they metamorph into the new Time Lord, right, who flies around and has adventures and saves the universe.
Casting
correctly.
changes.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So tell me about the Time Lords who've been the architecture critics at the New York Times. Who was the first one?
Well, famously, the first one was Ada Louise Huxtable, who remains, a sort of seminal figure in architecture, not just architectural writing. Ada Louise was a wonderful, extraordinary person and the kind of template in some ways for the architecture critic. So she had been involved in architecture and design, was writing for the Times, and I think was the real estate pages. In any case, there was no architecture critic in the late 50s and early 60s. And she made an argument which was, look, architecture is no less of an art than music or painting or literature. And so why is there not an architecture critic? You have a music critic, you have a theater critic.
Right, opera even at the time.
You have, right. And so the argument she was making was for architecture to be treated as an art form and to be treated essentially as an important cultural, not just a real estate matter in the city, but more broadly. That was an argument that needed to be made at the time, and I think she then used that platform to define a lot of things we take for granted about architecture criticism, that it was not just a thumbs up, thumbs down on the aesthetics of a building, but more broadly about the cities. And she remained actually a really important figure. Even after she left the Times, she became a critic later at the Wall Street Journal, I got to know her. I read her as a child and then got to know her when I came to this job. She was wonderful, supportive, and inspiring. When she moved on, I believe what happened is that she went to go to the editorial side. And when she did that, her younger colleague who had come on board already, Paul Goldberger, took over. And Paul was in that job for, of course, many years and redefined it for himself. And Paul was, an extraordinary writer and a dear friend. And
big baseball fan, too.
He's also a big baseball fan. And I think Paul continues to be an important writer on architecture. He went on to The New Yorker when Herbert Muschamp came on board. Mm-hmm. And Herbert was a very different kind of writer and had, I think, a style of writing that both excited some people and mortified others, which was...
Isn't that how it goes a lot of the time, right?
Well, I think in his case, it was really to his credit.
Yeah.
He wrote about architecture as if he were going through some, on the couch. And for him, it was a deeply personal thing. The people he wrote about, he often knew personally. Architecture was, he was analyzing buildings as one did a relationship, love. And I think he coincided with and helped to promote what's often called the era of Starchitecture, because he did have certain architects who he really wanted to define the era. Mm-hmm. He also treated architecture, in my mind, more as if it were an extension of sculpture. That was not at all exclusively the way he saw it. And he did some really brilliant, wild writing on buildings like 2 Columbus Circle and so forth. But I think there was the perception at that time, not only through Herbert, that architecture had elevated its profile in the world at somewhat at the cost of its larger range and mission and purpose. That's my opinion, because when Herbert left that job, he was replaced by Nikolai Orisov, mm-hmm. who had been a kind of protege, I think.
Or
of
up
Herbert's.
To 2011, roughly, right?
Yeah, and one of the things that's interesting here, because we're done now, then you get to me, is how few of us there have been. We're going back now, 60 years.
Well, it's like the Time Lords. There are not that many.
Not that many, right. Well, the Time Lords, you said every 3 or 4 years. I mean, there's an argument that critics shouldn't overstay their welcome.
Yeah.
I used to be the art critic here. I sort of believe that it's a useful thing if people don't stay forever, but I don't want to piss off my colleagues.
Right.
Of course, there are exceptions. I think in the architecture case, it's been a very privileged job, as I said before, but also a job held by very few people. We have a lot of critics. We've had a lot of critics over the years, but we've generally had a critic who defines a field. That's dissipated in recent years. That hierarchy of critics has disappeared.
And you've got the comment section, of every article, right?
Well, right. No, that's almost another subject. What I was going to say, there was in architecture, I think it's been very useful, and I'm happy when other people write about architecture for the paper, but I think the idea that there continues to be an architecture critic at times is a useful thing. It gives a little more potency to that voice. But I'm very biased in saying this, and I do like when other people write for us, and I encourage us to run other things. I will say about the comment section, yes, that is an interesting thing that's also happened as we've gone online. This question of, the Times' ambition, of course, is to create a place where you live with us 24 hours, or at least every waking hour. So you wake up and you do your Wordle and you...
I know, that thing has really caught on, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's addictive. And then you check out the headlines, and then you figure out what you're going to cook that night on the cooking app. And there's a lot of sort of ways in which you're living in the Times. And one of the things that we do now, of course, everyone else does too, is to allow people to comment, which is the illusion of a conversation that we are having.
Right.
This thing I founded, which is called Headway, which is now a philanthropically supported entity here at the Times. We've been trying to sort of think about how that interaction really works and to have a much more sort of directed and specific kind of conversation with the public, doing call outs. And I don't want to detour our conversation, but I do think as we move forward, we need to have a more honest public conversation around important subjects, the built world being way, way, way up there.
Yeah.
And to do that, we need more than a comment section. So I love and encourage this idea of having much more open, creative, constructive conversation that the Times and other news organizations can sort of instigate. That's why one writes, right? It's not to just declare an opinion. It's to stimulate a public conversation around something that's meaningful. That's the purpose here.
Yeah. Architects every 10 years, and I know this because I've been reading the magazines back 100 years, go through this existential crisis where the public doesn't understand what they do, doesn't like them necessarily, has this very stereotyped view of them in turtlenecks and funny blazers, walking around with thick glasses.
Right.
Right?
Interesting glasses.
Yeah, very interesting. And yet, when they have all the meetings and committees and things like that, what they always decide to do is they're going to somehow, some version of, elevating the public. They're going to take that public and scoot them up a couple floors to where the architects are. And no matter whether it's 1960 or 1990 or 2020, that seems to never, ever work. So what should architecture be doing instead to engage the public other than putting them on that elevator?
Well, it's a really good question. I never thought of it as an elevator. That's interesting. I mean, I think there was a point in New York City, for instance, when the public, to the extent it thought about architecture at all, assumed that if a building came down, even a really great building, another great building would go up.
Yeah.
And that there was a certain trust, even if it was benign and kind of unconsidered, that this was taken care of.
And then Madison Square Garden came along?
And then, yes, that was one thing. But I also think even before that, there was, I think modernism posed problems for the public that have not entirely been resolved. And the language around modernism, I think, also was difficult for many people in the public to understand.
Yeah, people went nuts about the Guggenheim and really opposed that for a long time.
Right, because it was so aggressively different. Now, of course, it's a work of genius and people love it. And most of the people who are there, by the way, are just there to see the building. They don't care what's on view inside it. So one of the things was that it was the very nature of modernism, I think, and that feeling that the public had lost trust that changed public attitudes. But I also think, look, architecture has always been a kind of luxury endeavor. And most people, when they build things, don't hire architects. It still is. But architects, I think, are underselling themselves all the time by presenting themselves as people who just do a certain kind of luxury thing. Because fundamentally, most architects are doing very basic things that are related to how we live. There are so many things about the way the architects are trained and practiced that really should make them essential players in our civic decisions. They're very good at understanding how to bring people together because you can't do architecture alone. They're very good at listening because they need clients and they need to work with government. So they're good at working through problems. A sculptor can just get materials and some money and build something. An architect can't just do that. It has to work with all these other people. Many people, especially I think younger architects these days, they go into the profession because they're interested in making people's lives better, improving neighborhoods and communities. They're interested in social issues and environmental issues and not just making, an extraordinarily vivid, beautiful, remarkable, challenging building. So that's what I think architects need to do, is to make themselves, make that aspect of their work better known. That's partly my job, right? It's partly turning a spotlight onto those aspects of architecture which are meaningful to a large number of people, some of whom may be alienated from the idea even of architecture as an elitist endeavor. I think that's fine, but some people find that offensive. But would be engaged by the kinds of things most architects, or many architects, really are most deeply committed to, which is building a better world, building a better city, a better society.
When you are referencing a building in your articles, I assume it's pretty easy to like a building. I mean, how do you tell an architect, either through your articles or on a phone call or something, that their design is just bad? It's like having the ugly baby. Nobody wants to tell the parents about the ugly baby, right? So how do you handle that as a critic?
Yeah, I've seen that episode of Seinfeld.
Right,
so
exactly.
I know what
It's
you mean.
remarkable.
Yeah. I just had a meeting with an architect who remained nameless and his colleagues. I went to their office, and I got a weird vibe. But like all architects I deal with, they were incredibly professional, and then we warmed up and it was fine. And I realized that I had some years ago, not that long ago, referred to a building they'd put up as, what was it? Belligerently ugly, almost belligerently ugly. And it's like, oh, that is why. But they were so nice. They didn't bring it up, and I didn't remember. And so the thing is, as a critic, I write mostly about projects that I think are meaningful.
Yeah.
Or problems that are out there, egregious. And it is my job to explain why that is the case. The question is, why are you doing this? I've been a critic in different fields.
Right.
And the thing that is always important is to understand that you are doing this for a public around issues that are larger than the thing itself. And could never be ad hominem, unless the only time that you ever, I think, would go after a person is if that person's work, in some way relevant to the public, is itself involved in personalities and is it implicated in creating mayhem or problems or whatever. I'm drifting a little bit here, but some people might say, imagine politicians who have that quality and whose personality is so determinative of who they are and what they're doing. But that's
You're
really
speaking of Oprah, of course.
Yeah, I adore her. No, I mean, I think with architects, nobody wants to be told that their work isn't liked. Everybody's work, if you're doing anything, there's a wide range of opinions about it, anything meaningful, as they say. I think that's true. I never speak out of malice. I don't, go after something because
It's not like a page 6 sort of vibe.
Right. I mean, I'm not just trying to sound, all Boy Scouty. I think that it is a thing in all fields as a writer, as a critic, that the sort of greatest traction you get inevitably is if you trash something. So I'll remind your listeners, if they didn't know, of course, that I wrote about Hudson Yards, a big project not far from where we're sitting here on the west side of Manhattan, multi-billion-dollar project. I really didn't like it, and I described at length why. People ate that up, I think, and I understand that, and I wrote it in a way that was intended to be vivid and engaging, colorful, not ad hominem. So I know the value of that you get a lot of traction as a writer. I think that's something one needs to resist, not because it isn't fun or readers don't like it, but because you're spending a lot of chips if that's how you come to be known.
Yeah, it's karma. It's karma too, right?
Yeah, it's also that's the guy who does that thing.
Yeah.
And you want to be, I think, perceived, you want to be a person who truly approaches things with an open mind, who has views but isn't so arrogant as to believe they're the only views that are out there. And we know of these people. They've been in every field, restaurant critic, movie critic, art critic. They're figures who've made their reputations doing that. Okay, it's just that's not my temperament or my ambition.
When you look out at the field of architects working in residential, who do you think is doing some of the more interesting work these days?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's not a field I pay attention to, especially because I don't really write about private houses very much. So I've seen these things more incidentally. Mm-hmm. It tends to correspond often with architects whose work I just like. I was looking at Michael Maltson's work in California the other day, and he was doing some houses which were really interesting.
He's been doing that a long time.
He has. He's been doing, obviously, some multifamily, big and affordable housing projects, but he obviously does private houses as well, as do many other people. One of the problems is when you get to a level of architect like that and you're doing private houses, those houses are often 15, 20,000 square feet on the side of a Hollywood hill.
20, 40, $60 million.
Exactly, right. I thought you were going to say 20, 40,000 square feet, those two. So they exist in some other universe. They're barely in the same category as the Schindler House or the Eames House or the things we think of as great California houses. The houses that I tend to love myself are older private houses, partly because the scale is small. I find the scale of houses that we're designing, these days just on the face of it offensive, incomprehensible to me, really. I don't know why people really need that much space.
And my understanding is, because I certainly don't own one of these, is that the bulk of these houses are empty most of the time. They're investments. They're not places where people live, but maybe a couple of months, maybe, if that.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's often said about a lot of the luxury, super tall building apartment. They're just investments. I'm sure some of them are. It's probably true of houses at that end of the market too, because I don't want to hook Michael up into that part, because Michael actually does mostly affordable housing when he's not doing other sorts of projects like the 6th Street Bridge. But yeah, I guess so, in the sense that very rich people have lots of houses. They probably don't live one place. It's mostly just this idea, I don't even understand it, that like people want to live in a Marriott or something. These houses are designed as a hotel. Yeah.
Yes.
With a spa at one end, then you got to walk like,
a movie theater,
50 yards to a movie theater, or the pool, the, infinity pool. It's just, I don't know why that's interesting. And spatially, it strikes me as being, who wants to constantly be in a space that's overwhelming and feels somehow empty? There's something vacuous about the very notion of it. But we measure things in numbers in this country especially, and so, the square footage of a house is somehow considered a measure of something. I think it's a measure of idiocy never mind all the climate implications of it. Think about it. When you go to a house like the Schindler House, which we mentioned before we came on air, it's very small, tiny, really,
yeah.
Extraordinarily beautiful, in a not perfectly finished way, expressive, private, open. It's a lot of things which are packed into a very tiny space. If you were now putting that on the market and said, I'm building a whatever it is, 1,500 square foot, I don't know the size of it, it would be like, no, that's not worth it on that plot of real estate. Who would ever build something that tiny on that much land in the middle of LA? So I find that really deeply sad. And what will make that change, I don't know. It has a lot to do with just, growing income inequities. But also, it's not just the rich people who are doing this. There's a lot of McMansions, obviously, that have become, taken over.
It may be my Mrs. Maisel brain being romantic about the 50s and 60s. But what I'm wondering is, in your view, are the clients that are funding most of these major private projects in New York, are they changing? Are they getting savvier about architecture? Are they straying away from innovation? I mean, what's happening on the client side of it, the developers and the hedge funds and the corporations that are building here?
Well, you're not talking about only private houses, or you're talking about mostly houses?
No, I'm talking about the office buildings and the.
Well, I think in New York City, that's a big subject. It's really hard to sort of generalize about this, right? But you had a wave of construction of office buildings, luxury towers, and so forth. That seems to be subsiding now, and we're going into a lull. And COVID was part of that. Interest rates are part of that, and so forth. Those construction booms that we have gone through were both on the office and residential sides. But a place like Hudson Yards is interesting that the presumption was the money could be made in the luxury residential towers, and then it turned out that the office towers were actually more profitable. Then COVID hit, and now there's this question of, we have this crazy abundance of office space. What are we going to do with all of it? Maybe we need to build more housing, but we don't want more luxury towers. And the people who do one don't necessarily do
the other. Or do it well.
That's correct. That said, I think this is an interesting moment in New York because it is a difficult time, and I think we're going to have to come out the other end of this. I think some people are being more pessimistic than I am about how long it will take and what the nature of the problem is. But what happens at these moments that's historically happened in New York is there's often a chance to rethink, to reboot the conversation around what we build. So it's not just that there are some people dreaming that we can turn empty office towers into apartment buildings, because that's largely a dream and a very limited idea. But that idea, what do we want? What do we need? How do we build a neighborhood? What are the components of that? How do we mix housing and have mixed income housing and all that sort of stuff? I think we're at a place where people are open to talking about stuff in a much more sophisticated way. So, for instance, we're beginning projects now around some old NYCHA housing projects, tear down and rebuild. That was out of the question. It happens in other countries. I've written about it in Paris and in London. Here, I think that's really interesting. We have over 500,000, maybe as many as 750,000 people living in New York City's public housing, NYCHA, it's called. That's the population of many large American cities.
Absolutely.
That entity and those buildings are about, I'm not making this number up, about $90 billion in the hole in capital repairs alone. So that's, I don't know, we would have to look it up. Your listeners can look up how many countries have a GDP of $90 billion. There've got to be at least a couple.
Yeah.
There's an unfathomable number. What are we going to do? So that kind of problem is not isolated. It can be connected with other issues like, well, maybe these campuses, if they need to be rebuilt, can be rebuilt in a way that both protect the people who are there, provide them with humane, dignified new housing, and provide other housing as well, because we need a lot more of it. We have many homeless people here. We have many working people here who can't afford to live in New York. We have many middle-class people who can. So, for instance, that's one typology of housing that I think is gradually being rethought. The problem really is that it's easier to think of change than to make it happen. And in a place like New York, and especially in our era, we live at a time when saying no and weaponizing regulations, even environmental regulations, landmark stuff, NIMBYism in general is very potent. And the pace of change needs to be faster, not slower now, with climate and everything else. So I think these ideas are out there. And the next idea that's really important is how can we get around some of these regulatory and NIMBY hurdles that are maybe very well intended, but are ultimately going to have a very negative impact on the city and on people.
And I don't know how it is in New York, but in my state, North Carolina, and other states, a lot of this came from local and state regulations, which prohibited the federal government essentially from building the things that make a housing project a community. You couldn't have schools, you couldn't have stores, you couldn't have industry, you couldn't have places of religious worship, all these things that you could not build at the property besides just the housing. So warehousing got built essentially for people. And, we all know how that turned out mostly.
Yeah, I mean, this was, of course, a mid-century, it's still, you're telling me it persists there in North Carolina too, urban planning calamity, right? It was, and you saw it going back to Corbouen and, this idea of your sort of sectioning off parts of a city or a community according to its uses. Look, New York is the explanation for why that doesn't work, right? It's like, what do you come to New York for? It is because of the density, the mixing together of things, the fact that residential, business, public spaces, all these things are together, and that's what makes a vibrant community. We've known this for a long time, so those regulations definitely need to be rethought. And where they are being rethought, and that's happening, for instance, in parts of California where they have such a housing crisis, and people are realizing, okay, look, you have 75% of Los Angeles, the city of Los Angeles or more, I think, zoned for single-family housing.
Yeah.
That's just untenable.
Yeah.
And in fact, if you allow some infill housing, not just granny flats, but maybe something more ambitious than that, and a little commercial development too, it is possible to walk to the coffee shop 2 or 3 blocks away, as opposed to having to get in your car. That's not so bad.
Yeah.
And I think there are, in other words, New York is not the only model. There's a million things that are between what you're describing, North Carolina, and the street in New York that we are now sitting on.
Okay.
So I think that's the conversation we need to have. Like, we need to allow for change because we now have housing crises in many cities. That is an opportunity to rethink our cities, to build some incredible buildings, neighborhoods. It's an architectural opportunity, and we need to do it quickly.
Last question.
Sure.
The vessel. What the fuck? I mean,
Yeah.
what was intended by that, and how did it become the city's leading suicide site, and what's going to happen next? That's my last ridiculous architecture question.
Yeah, so it's at Hudson Yards. It's by Heather Wick, who, as I said in that article, is obviously a billionaire whisperer. He's somebody who seems to have the ability to persuade these guys, in this case, Steve Ross, that this is a thing. It's tragic. I mean, it's tragic for a lot of reasons. I mean, obviously, above all, because it has come to be, this place where people have committed suicide and which is associated with that. It's I don't know how you come back from that. But it began with the wrong thought, which is that's actually public land in New York. But it was turned over by this city to the private developer to use as he wished. And he had this idea that if you have this kind of thing that people can climb on that's really shiny and big, maybe people will come to shop at his mall. So it was really just a gimmick to gin up traffic for shopping. At least that's the way it's always come across. So it's tragic in a lot of ways. I won't even go into Heather Wick's ability to sell these sort of things. But you always need a few vessels to remind yourself why the Schindler Building or the Empire State Building or the Guggenheim are really things we need and love.
So what is the word on the street about the future of the vessel? Are they going to tear it down? Or?
Yeah. I have not heard, and I have to admit I would not be the first person they'd call to tell me what's going on. I think it cost something like $250 million of Related's money. I'm not entirely sure of that number, but that rings a distant bell. So I'm skeptical that they're just going to take it down and put it in storage. But I don't know how they can open it. And you can't really add barriers. Look, in fairness, certainly to Heather Wick and these guys, that you can't make every building, every rooftop, you cannot safeguard everything. You just can't. And people will. We're in the New York Times building here. When this opened, Renzo Piano's screens out on the outside were used by people who climbed up them.
Yes.
Like ladders.
Yeah.
So, fortunately nobody killed themselves, and they've tried to find a way to prevent that now. Nobody's doing it. But that just can happen. It's not, nobody should blame Heather Wick for this, of course. On the other hand, at this point, that's really what it is a place now associated with these horrible incidents. And I don't know who wants to climb up it. By the way, the other thing about climbing up it, which was always nuts, is that it's surrounded, really surrounded by gigantic skyscrapers. So it's not like you're climbing up to look out over the city from this great vista. You're like, whatever it is, 10 stories high, surrounded by buildings that are 80 stories high, 100 stories high. I don't know. You're just still looking up at these buildings. So nothing really happens when you get up there. That's the other problem. You can go into the mall and look out the window and get more or less the same view.
Yeah.
So I think the whole thing was a sort of sales pitch. It never really worked, even on the terms it set for itself, which is that there was something uplifting about the procession up there and then the views out. I don't think that's true. So what can they do? I don't know. They can glass it in. I don't know who goes up there. Mostly what I saw was people taking selfies.
Yeah.
And they'll still do that. So maybe
they'll still do that.
It's still serving some purpose.
Maybe that's a good project for an architecture studio class. Like, how do we repurpose the vessel for the future? We could turn it into a giant aquarium, for instance. Just kind of fill it
Glass
in.
the whole thing.
Right,
yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And have the giant sharks. You could even put boats in there.
That's
floating
kind of
around on the surface.
I like that.
Michael, thank you so much for talking with me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Returning guest Monika Ryan is a jazz vocalist known for her rich and emotive voice. A graduate of the New School for Jazz and Contemporary Music, she was a professional singer in New York City even as a teenager. Monika is a skilled interpreter of classic jazz standards, captivating audiences by infusing old tunes with modern sensibility. She's also a jazz composer and recording artist, and she's just released her 14th full-length album featuring all new original material. George recently spoke with Monika via Zoom.
Monika, it is always a pleasure to have you back on the show, and you've been pretty busy since then. You have a new album.
I do. Thank you. And it's always a pleasure to come on your show. I love your show.
So tell me about the album.
This album, I'm so excited about the album. It was an album that sort of developed out of itself. I had the idea that I wanted to work with a particular person who lives in Spain, and I was headed to Spain. And he's a friend of mine, and we have long wanted to record together and never had the chance. So I was headed right to where he was, and I reached out to him and offered him, asked him, invited him to record an album. And he said he'd love to. So we put it on the books and we set wheels into motion. And it was largely recorded in Spain and then added on to in New York.
Okay.
Yeah.
And can you tell us who this mystery man is?
Yes. He's a wonderful Brazilian guitar player living in Spain, in Valencia, Spain, named Sergio Pereira. He's known for his guitar playing. He's also a very wonderful singer, but he didn't sing on my album. I wanted him to. I said, come on, let's do a duet. Come on. But he is a little shy about his singing. He does do it. I know many great musicians who are also wonderful singers who are a little bit shy about singing. And I hope one day to get many of them singing with me. But anyway, he's wonderful.
That would be a great concept album right there.
Yeah, it would be fun, right? To duets with people who don't usually sing, who are great singers.
I noticed that on the 13 tracks, 3 of them have the word away in the title. Did you really want to get away for this album?
I did. Yes, I did. When we set the wheels in motion for making this album, we were both very busy. Both Sergio and I were recording and producing albums on our own. We divided and conquered. We wrote the first song together. And then he said, I really don't have the time to write the music. Can you write the music? And I said, sure, I'll write the music. Can you hire the bass player and the drummer in the studio? And he said, sure, no problem. And we really divided and conquered. He hired the guys and the studio, and I wrote the music. And it was such a busy time. I was writing this music in August and September. And I have 2 teenagers, and it was, the end of the summer and the beginning of the school year, and I needed a break really badly. And so, if you're writing what you know, writing what's authentic,
sure.
I needed to get away, which fortunately I was going to be recording away. So it ended up being perfect for what it was.
Here's Monika with Let's Get Away.
Let's get away. Let's take off somewhere in the blue. Let's get away to a little hideaway, just we two, me and you. Let's get away. Maybe to an island in the sun. Let's get away. You and I deserve a little fun. We can stroll along the shoreline, holding hands together. We can stroll along the shoreline, holding hands while listening to the waves. We can dance beneath the moonlight and melt away in a lover's haze. Let's get away somewhere far away from it all. Let's get away to recharge and refuel together.
I want to go away now, Monika. That is a great tune.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's, an invitation, come away. Yeah. The whole album is about living fully and being alive. The theme of the album is living your fullest life in every definition of that.
It seems to me like this would be a great tune to sell to an airline. You could make a ton of money.
I had that thought, and I did. I appreciate that. I had that thought for two of the songs, but I don't have connections in the airline business. But if there's an airline listening.
Yes, airline marketing executives, this is the tune for your next campaign. I mean, you could tie it to anywhere, to Europe, to Hawaii, to South America, even to Cleveland. This is the tune.
Right, about just getting away, stepping away for a second. Yeah, which is healthy for us to do from time to time.
You have proclaimed yourself, and it's evident from your social media postings, that you are a great multitasker. You can juggle like 24 balls in the air at the same time.
Yeah, I do. Well, it's modern life, but also I like it. I'm a joyful and intense creator in the sense that I'm always working, but I love what I do. So it's a joy for me, but because I'm always doing it, I make a lot of progress and I make space for other people to catch up, essentially. So if I keep many things going at the same time, nobody else feels rushed. I can keep going and keep creating because I love it so much and leave space for other people to participate at their own pace. So I'm busy because I love what I do. And everything that I'm involved with, I'm very grateful and happy about.
That is a beautiful description because most people are complaining about their multitasking these days.
I can imagine if there's something that you don't feel aligned with or that you feel like is sort of discordant about it, I can see how it would feel that way. But I really do have the great joy of doing what I love. I want people who work with me and who are in my orbit to feel good about that. So I try to create that environment, and it makes it ultimately more joyful for me.
I feel a lot of joy around this next song called This Morning. Tell me about that song. Did you write it?
I did. I wrote all of the songs on the album myself, except for Can You Slip Away, which I wrote with Sergio. Well, the first thing we do in the morning, we wake up, we check our social media, we check the news, we want to know what's happening with the day. Life is really, really busy right now. It's moving faster. Life moves faster than I've ever experienced it before. And I think it takes a good bit of intention to pause and take a step back and to nurture yourself and nurture relationships. So this song starts out with the early news can wait, the phones and the socials will be there in an hour. And it's about pulling back and enjoying that special time, quality time with either a loved one or yourself, taking a moment to breathe before, the pace of life pulls you into the pace of life.
Here's Monika with This Morning.
The early news can wait. The phones and the socials will be there in an hour. Let's take some time to celebrate life together. The morning's full of song from high up in the trees. Birds are greeting a new day. Let's pause to taste the sweet before the circus draws us in. Quickly now, faster than we've ever known before. All we have is now. Living is what life is for. The day will come soon enough. The tide will roll on in, drawing us out to the world before we let it begin. Let's savor every second now. The day will come soon enough. The tide will roll on in, drawing us out to the world before we let it begin. Let's savor every second now. Stay with me a little longer. Every minute my heart's stronger. Once the day begins, it will go and go and go. The world can wait. The world will wait. But time won't wait for anything. This is our time.
with your two kids. Are they into this kind of music that you do, or is this just something that mom does?
Well, my kids are really musical. We have a musical household. They have their own tastes, of course. They're their own people. But we've exposed them to music from, before they were born, actually. But my son plays guitar, and my daughter plays bassoon. And she plays with the Philadelphia Youth Orchestra. And they have incredible taste in music. My son listens to everything. And every once in a while, he's 17. Every once in a while, he'll be driving along in his car and he'll hear something on the radio that, some avant-garde jazz. And he'll say, Mom has to hear this. And he'll pull over and he'll put his camera on the radio station and record a bit of the music and say, Mom, check this music out. It's pretty fun. I love it.
Thank you so much for coming on the show, Monika. It is always a joy to have you. The new album is Alive, and you can learn more about it at MonikaRyan.com. That's MonikaRyan.com. Come back on the show again, please, Monika.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger, and by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs. Okay, Tom, take us out.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 20,500 significant modernist houses, and access 4.3 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song is performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl, with guest research by archivist Kelly Policelli. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I'll be back soon with another Pulitzer Prize-winning edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.
Did they give Pulitzers for podcasts?
How about a Wurlitzer?